Questions, because it's always fun to watch judges fight with each other. Okay, so just as, as a way to think about copyright questions in AI, I think it's easiest to break them down into questions related to inputs. These are things that are coming into the models that we use to train the models, and then outputs, what comes out of those models and how copyright connects to them. That's a basic framework. It doesn't work. It doesn't even work for this entire talk, but I think it is useful as a kind of initial framework for thinking about these questions. Now, when we're talking about U.S. law and copyright, and U.S. law and copyrighted AI, much of the analysis happens around fair use. I learned yesterday that Korean law has a very similarly structured fair use. So I will not spend very much time on this slide, except to point out that that fourth factor, the impact of the use on the market for the value of the copyrighted work, this is, as a preview, what we're going to talk about in about 5 minutes, this is the thing that the judges are fighting about whether or not these models, how to think about their impact on the work. So the fourth factor is going to be important to the judges fighting at the end of this talk. So when we think about this first category of questions, these input questions, right? One of the questions is, does collecting and compiling the works in anticipation of training infringe on the copyright? But if you're going to train an LLM, you need a bunch of data. It's probably not your data because no one has that much data. So you're collecting it from the world. And does that collection violate anyone's copyrights? And then once you have that collection, does using those works to actually train the model violate the copyright in those, infringe on the copyright in those works? Right? So these are kind of copyright input questions that we could spend hours debating, but we're not going to do that because it's the end of the day. And then the output questions are separate, but also potentially equally interesting, right? Does the thing that comes out of a model, does that infringe on a specific work, or the specific output? And if so, who's responsible for that? Is it the user who wrote the prompt? Is it the person who trained the model? Is it someone else entirely? Is it some combination of those people? Fun conversation about output questions. And then also, is the output even protected by copyright? Right? Does anyone own a copyright in the output? As I said, this is a useful framework, but the framework doesn't even work for the length of this talk because there's this bonus question that's neither an input nor an output question. And this is the question of, is the AI model itself a copy of all of the works used to train it? How to think about that question, which is another potentially impactful copyright question when it comes to AI. So one of the features of the American legal system is that it pushes people to litigate quickly and massively. And so what it gives us is pretty quickly a concrete set of facts to use. So the questions that I just talked about, right, they're interesting questions, but they're kind of like hypothetical abstract questions. The US legal system gives us specific facts to apply to these questions pretty quickly. Now this is better or worse because sometimes these facts are kind of weird, but at least they give us some specificity. So I want to talk about two cases that have already been litigating some of these facts. The first is Bart's versus Anthropic. This is a case where a bunch of authors are trying to be class action lawsuit against Engelberg, one of the big AI companies. The facts of that case is Anthropic, when they began the process of creating their model, the first thing they did is they downloaded what are euphemistically referred to as shadow libraries. These are unauthorized compilations of many, many books floating around the darker corners of the internet. So they were downloading all of these compilations of books from random places to build their library, their training library. At some point, they hired some people and switched from downloading shadow libraries to buying physical copies of books and digitizing those books. So they were spending like tens of millions of dollars buying books, cutting the spines off the back of them, scanning them, and digitizing them. And so with that combination of things, they first created an internal general reference library of works, right? So it's a big collection of works, and they would pull combinations of those works to train specific models. And so they were sued, and the opinion which came out this summer made a number of findings. The first is that training itself, training the model from the works, is transformative and is protected by fair use, and that the LLMs are not reproductions of the books used to train them. They're something else. Also, that the digitizing of the purchase books, so the books they bought in physical copies and scanned, that's also protected by fair use. However, the unauthorized downloads of the shadow libraries is not protected by fair use. And because the judge found that that activity, just building that library with unauthorized copies, was not protected by fair use, the judge did not make a ruling on whether or not using those shadow libraries to train the models was itself protected by fair use. So this was an opinion that was kind of mostly a win for Anthropic, except for that last part. And so this case is now settling on the specific question of the unauthorized downloads without really getting to any sort of damages or litigation around the training, which in some ways is a more interesting question here. The next case, the second case, is another set of authors who were suing Meta, obviously a different AI company, or a different company that happens to be in the AI business. Their facts are a little bit different. Meta started their process by trying to license the books. They reached out to a bunch of publishers and authors, and it sounds like no one returned their emails, which we can all kind of empathize with. We've all been there. We tried to do something nice. We reached out. No one returned their emails. And so then they switched to torrenting the same shadow libraries. You know, this is important, potentially important going forward, because as many of you are familiar with BitTorrent protocol, BitTorrent, you don't only just download the files, but you also upload, so you might be distributing the files. That's going to be kind of explored later, potentially. And then Meta did post-training work to avoid memorization or outputting the full copies of any books that they use to train the model. So a slightly different set of facts, slightly a different judge, slightly different outcome. The judge found that the training is transformative, and this is different than the other case, illegally acquiring the source material does not undermine that claim. So the fact that Meta used unauthorized shadow libraries to train the model still allows them to claim fair use on the training. Also, that the Meta LLM does not reproduce the books used to train it. This is not a surprise, especially because they did that post-training to try and prevent that. And the authors cannot claim the harm of the economic harm of the loss of the licensing market. This is also not a surprise. In the US, every plaintiff wants to claim that the economic harm to them is they could have licensed the works for a price of their choosing. And that is generally rejected by US courts. It's kind of a circular argument because you're kind of creating a market that doesn't exist that you want to exist. The twist for this case is, so this reads as like a win for Meta all the way down. But the judge was very angry about writing this case because one argument that the plaintiffs did not make is that that creating the works, the LLM, doesn't copy or reproduce the books, but it will flood the market with so many competitors that it reduces the value of the input books in the market. And his opinion, sometimes you describe opinion as like hinting that the judge wants plaintiffs to do something. This opinion is screaming at the plaintiffs to please have made this argument because they would have won. But they didn't make the argument, so they cannot win. The judge is very frustrated about this. So maybe he makes his arguments that come up in the future. Now, I told you I was going to end with judges fighting, so I will. These opinions came out 2 days apart. And they differ very significantly on how to think about market harm. Right? The first opinion essentially understands LLMs as learning from the training material and says there's no market harm with these LLMs because it's just like if someone read a book to learn how to become a writer and then wrote their own book. That book is competing against the books they read, but we don't think about that as a market harm. That's the opinion that came out first. The opinion that came out second said, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that these books were used to train this machine that can spit out an infinite number of competitors almost immediately. And so this is the only rational way to think about it. And in fact, this second opinion goes on to basically say the first judge is an idiot. This inapt analogy, the first judge's analogy, is not a basis for blowing off the most important factor in the fair use analysis. So this is very strong language in an opinion from one judge to another. So this is a very active debate right now within U.S. courts. There are many more things we can say about copyright and AI, but I will stop there because at the end of the day, I will say thank you and I'll ask Seb to come on up to give his presentation, and then if we have any time, maybe we'll do some questions and see what's happening. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Director Michael Weinberg. Our last speaker, Dr. Sebastian Engelberg, he will give us a very interesting presentation of the judiciary duty of the artificial intelligence. Please join me giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sebastian.